of Mice and Men. By John Steinbeck. Chapter 1, On the Road Again. George and Lennie trudged down the dusty road, their boots scuffing against the dirt. They had been walking for hours, their stomachs growling with hunger and their skin prickling with heat. It was the middle of summer, and the sun beat down on them mercilessly. George wiped the sweat from his brow and sighed. "I don't know how much more of this I can take, Lennie," he said. "We've been walking for hours, and we still don't have any work lined up." Lennie, who had been lost in thought, looked up at his friend. "I know, George," he said. "But we can't give up. We need to find work so we can save up for our own farm." George nodded. It was a dream they had shared since they first met, back when they were both young and naive. They had traveled together from job to job, saving up their wages and dreaming of the day when they could buy their own land and live off the fat of the land. But it seemed like the dream was slipping further and further away with each passing day. Jobs were scarce, and the ones that were available were often dangerous and poorly paid. As they walked, they passed by fields of wheat and corn, the golden stalks swaying in the breeze. George looked out at the horizon, trying to spot any signs of civilization. Suddenly, he heard the sound of an engine in the distance. He perked up, hoping it was a car or truck that could give them a ride. Sure enough, a battered old pickup truck came into view, kicking up a cloud of dust as it approached. George and Lennie stepped off the road and waited for the truck to pull up beside them. The driver, a grizzled old man with a bushy beard, leaned out the window. "You boys need a ride?" he asked. George and Lennie looked at each other, then back at the man. "Yes, please," George said. "We've been walking for hours." The man nodded and gestured for them to climb in the back of the truck. George and Lennie hoisted themselves up, settling in among the crates and barrels. As the truck rumbled down the road, George and Lennie breathed a sigh of relief. They had a long way to go, but at least they weren't walking anymore. They chatted with the driver, learning that he was a migrant worker like themselves. He told them about the different jobs and ranches in the area, giving them some tips on where to find work. By the time they arrived at their destination, the sun was beginning to set. They thanked the driver and hopped out of the truck, stretching their stiff limbs. They looked around, taking in their new surroundings. It was a small town, with a few stores and a post office. They could see fields in the distance, and the silhouettes of mountains against the pink and purple sky. "Well, here we are," George said. "Let's see if we can find a place to sleep and some dinner." Lennie nodded, his eyes already scanning the town for signs of food. They set off down the main street, ready to start their search anew. Chapter 2, A Place to Call Home. George and Lennie had finally found a new ranch to work on. It was a small operation, with only a handful of workers and a few buildings, but it looked well kept and organized. As they approached the main house, they were greeted by the owner, a tall, thin man with a sharp nose and piercing eyes. "Welcome to the ranch," he said, extending a hand to shake theirs. "My name is Carlson. I'm the boss around here." George and Lennie introduced themselves, and Carlson gave them a quick tour of the property. There were stables for the horses, a barn for the cows and sheep, and a small bunkhouse where the workers slept. As they walked, George and Lennie couldn't help but feel a sense of excitement. This was their chance to start fresh, to earn some money and save up for their own place. After the tour, Carlson showed them to the bunkhouse and assigned them each a bed. The other workers were already there, lounging on their bunks and chatting. George and Lennie set down their bags and looked around. The room was small and cramped, with 6 beds crammed together against the walls. There was a small table and chairs in the corner, and a few shelves for personal belongings. "It's not much, but it'll do," George said, trying to sound optimistic. Lennie nodded, looking around wide-eyed. "It's better than sleeping outside," he said. Over the next few days, George and Lennie settled into their new routine. They worked long hours, helping with the animals and the fields. They ate meals with the other workers, a mix of old-timers and newbies like themselves. Despite the hard work and long hours, they enjoyed their time at the ranch. There was a sense of camaraderie among the workers, a shared sense of purpose and hardship. At night, they would sit outside and talk, looking up at the stars and dreaming of their own farm. They talked about the crops they would grow, the animals they would raise, and the house they would build. "It'll be the best damn farm in the valley," George would say, grinning. Lennie would nod, his face lighting up at the thought of their future. "And we'll have rabbits," he would say, his voice filled with wonder. As the weeks went by, George and Lennie started to save up their wages. They kept a careful tally of their earnings, dreaming of the day when they would have enough to buy their own place. One day, as they were working in the fields, Carlson approached them. "Boys, I've been watching you," he said. "And I think you're good workers. In fact, I have a proposition for you." George and Lennie looked at each other, intrigued. "I'm thinking of expanding the ranch," Carlson continued. "And I need someone to help manage it. Someone I can trust. Someone like you too." George and Lennie's eyes widened. They had never thought about managing a ranch before. "What do you say?" Carlson asked, looking at them expectantly. George and Lennie looked at each other, then back at Carlson. "We say yes," George said, grinning from ear to ear. Lennie nodded vigorously. "Yes, yes," he said, his face beaming. They shook hands with Carlson, feeling a sense of pride and accomplishment. This was it, they thought. This was the beginning of their new life, their chance to make their dream a reality. Chapter 3: Friendship and Betrayal. George and Lennie had been working on the ranch for a few weeks now, and they had settled into a comfortable routine. They worked hard during the day, and at night they talked about their dream of owning their own farm. But their sense of peace was about to be shattered. One day, while they were working in the fields, they met a man named Slim. Slim was tall and lean, with a quiet confidence that drew people to him. George and Lennie were immediately drawn to him, and they struck up a conversation. As they talked, George couldn't help but notice how Slim seemed to understand Lennie in a way that few others did. He treated him with kindness and respect, and didn't seem to mind his simple-mindedness. Over the next few days, George and Lennie got to know Slim better. They learned that he was a skilled mule driver, and that he had a way of calming even the most stubborn animal. One night, as they were sitting outside the bunkhouse, Slim approached them. "Hey, you guys want to come with me to the barn?" he asked. George and Lennie looked at each other, then back at Slim. "Sure," George said. They followed Slim to the barn, where he showed them a litter of puppies that one of the ranch dogs had recently had. "They're cute, aren't they?" Slim said, smiling. Lennie's eyes widened. "Can I pet one?" he asked. Slim nodded, and Lennie reached out to stroke one of the puppies. The little dog wagged its tail, licking Lennie's hand. George watched as Lennie's face lit up with joy. He couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude towards Slim. It was rare to find someone who treated Lennie with such kindness. Over the next few days, Slim and Lennie became fast friends. They would talk for hours about the farm they wanted to own, and Slim would listen patiently as Lennie told him about the rabbits he hoped to have. But their friendship was about to be tested. One night, when most of the workers were at the local brothel, Lennie and Curly's wife were left alone in the barn. Curly's wife had been flirting with Lennie for days, and he was drawn to her in a way that he didn't quite understand. As they talked, Curly's wife started to touch Lennie's hair. He was nervous, but didn't want to upset her. He tried to pull away, but she held on tighter. Meanwhile, outside the barn, Slim had a feeling that something was wrong. He had noticed that Lennie and Curly's wife were missing, and he knew that Lennie had a tendency to get into trouble. He went to the barn and saw Lennie and Curly's wife inside. He could tell that Lennie was uncomfortable, and he knew that he had to intervene. "Hey, Lennie, you need to come with me," Slim said, his voice calm but firm. Lennie looked at Slim, then at Curly's wife. He knew he had messed up, but he didn't know what to do. "Come on, Lennie," Slim said, taking him by the arm. As they left the barn, Curly's wife called after Lennie, her voice filled with anger and frustration. Lennie looked back at her, confused and scared. The next day, the entire ranch was buzzing with the news of what had happened in the barn. George and Lennie tried to keep their heads down, but they knew that their friendship with Slim had. Chapter 4, Hard Times. The days on the ranch were getting harder for George and Lennie. The summer heat was intense, and the work was exhausting. To make matters worse, Curly had become even more hostile towards them since the incident with his wife in the barn. One day, as they were working in the fields, George noticed that Lennie was struggling to keep up. His face was red, and he was panting heavily. "You okay, Lennie?" George asked. Lennie nodded, but George could see that he was lying. He knew that Lennie needed a break, but he also knew that they couldn't afford to fall behind on their work. As they finished up for the day, George made a decision. They were going to take a day off and go fishing at the river. It was a risk, but George hoped that it would help Lennie to recharge and get some much-needed rest. The next day, they woke up early and set out towards the river. It was a beautiful day, and the sun was shining brightly. They walked in silence for a while, enjoying the peacefulness of the countryside. As they got closer to the river, they noticed that there were other people fishing as well. George was worried that they wouldn't be able to find a good spot, but they eventually found a secluded spot where they could fish in peace. For a while, they fished in silence. Lennie was content to watch the water and enjoy the sunshine, while George focused on catching some fish for their dinner. But their peaceful afternoon was about to be interrupted. As they were packing up their gear, they heard shouting coming from the direction of the ranch. George recognized Curly's voice, and he knew that something was wrong. They quickly made their way back to the ranch, and when they arrived, they saw a group of men gathered around something. Curiosity got the better of them, and they pushed their way through the crowd. What they saw made George's blood run cold. Curly's wife was lying on the ground, motionless. Her neck was broken, and her face was twisted in a grotesque expression of pain. George looked at Lennie, and he knew what had happened. Lennie had been with her, and in his confusion and fear, he had accidentally killed her. The news of the death spread quickly around the ranch, and soon everyone was looking for Lennie. George knew that they had to leave, and they had to leave quickly. They gathered their belongings and set out towards the mountains. George knew that they couldn't go back to their old life. They would have to start over somewhere else, where no one knew them. As they walked, George thought about everything that had happened. He was angry with Lennie, but he also knew that he couldn't blame him entirely. Lennie was simple-minded, and he didn't understand the consequences of his actions. They walked for miles, and as the sun began to set, they came across a small clearing. George knew that they had to rest, and he made a fire and set up camp. As they sat by the fire, George couldn't help but feel a sense of sadness. He had lost his dream of owning a farm, and he had lost his friend. He knew that life would never be the same again. Chapter 5, The Breaking Point. George and Lennie had been on the run for a few days now. They had managed to evade the authorities, but they were running low on food and water. George knew that they couldn't keep going like this for much longer. One day, as they were walking through a field, Lennie suddenly stopped and looked up at the sky. "Look, George," he said. "The sky is so pretty today." George looked up and saw that the sky was indeed a beautiful shade of blue. But he couldn't focus on the beauty of it. His mind was consumed by their situation and the fear that they would never be able to escape their past. As they continued walking, they came across a small stream. Lennie was thrilled, and he ran ahead to take a drink. But as he was drinking, he accidentally stepped on a small mouse that was scurrying by. Lennie was devastated. He loved animals, and he hated the thought of hurting one. But George knew that they couldn't afford to dwell on it. They had to keep moving. As they walked, they came across a small farm. George had an idea. He knew that they needed to find work and a place to stay, and this farm seemed like the perfect opportunity. They approached the farm, and the owner, an old man named Candy, greeted them. Candy was kind and offered them a job working on the farm. At first, everything seemed to be going well. Lennie loved the animals on the farm, and George was happy to have a steady job and a place to stay. But then things took a turn for the worse. Curly, the ranch owner's son, had been causing trouble. He was still angry about what had happened to his wife, and he was looking for someone to take it out on. He targeted Lennie, taunting him and picking fights. George knew that this couldn't go on forever. He knew that Lennie was vulnerable and that he couldn't defend himself against Curly. One day, Curly went too far. He attacked Lennie, and Lennie, in his confusion and fear, fought back. He didn't mean to hurt Curly, but he was much stronger than he realized. The other men on the farm were furious, and they set out to find Lennie. George knew that they would never understand what had happened, and he knew that Lennie was in grave danger. He found Lennie hiding in a barn, and he knew that he had to act fast. He had to protect his friend, even if it meant doing something that he didn't want to do. He pulled out his gun and aimed it at the back of Lennie's head. Tears filled his eyes as he pulled the trigger. Lennie fell to the ground, and George knew that it was over. As he walked away from the barn, George felt a sense of emptiness. He had lost his friend, and he knew that he would never be able to escape the guilt of what he had done. But he also knew that it was the only way to protect Lennie from a fate that was much worse. Chapter 6, The End of the Road. George sat on the bank of the river, staring out at the water. He had lost everything that mattered to him, his friend Lennie, his dream of owning a farm, and his sense of purpose. He had spent the last few days wandering aimlessly, trying to come to terms with what had happened. He knew that he would never be able to escape the guilt of killing Lennie, and he didn't know how to move on. As he sat there, lost in thought, he heard footsteps approaching. He turned to see a familiar figure walking towards him, Slim, the ranch hand who had always been kind to him. "Hey, George," Slim said. "You okay?" George shook his head. "No, Slim. I don't think I'll ever be okay again." Slim sat down next to him and put a hand on his shoulder. "I know it's tough, George. But you did what you had to do. You protected your friend, even if it meant making a hard decision." George nodded, but he couldn't shake the feeling of emptiness inside him. He had lost his friend, and he had lost his dream. He didn't know what he was supposed to do now. As they sat there, a car pulled up beside them. It was the ranch owner, looking for George. He told him that he had some paperwork for him to sign, but George knew that he couldn't stay on the ranch any longer. He had to leave to start over somewhere new. He signed the papers and said goodbye to Slim. As he walked away, he knew that he was truly alone now. He had no one left in the world, and he didn't know where to go or what to do. He wandered for a while longer, sleeping in fields and eating whatever he could find. But he knew that he couldn't keep going like this forever. He had to find a new purpose, a reason to keep going. One day, he came across a small town. He walked into a diner and sat down at the counter. The waitress asked him what he wanted to eat, and he ordered a coffee. As he sipped his coffee, he overheard a group of men talking at the table behind him. They were discussing a job opening at a nearby farm, and George knew that he had to take the opportunity. He approached the men and asked about the job. They told him that they needed someone to work the fields, and George knew that he had the experience they were looking for. He applied for the job and was hired on the spot. He knew that it wasn't the life he had dreamed of, but it was a start. It was a way for him to move forward, to find a new purpose. As he worked the fields, he thought about Lennie and their dream of owning a farm. He knew that it was never going to happen now, but he also knew that he had to keep moving forward. He had to make something of his life, to honor Lennie's memory. In the end, George found a new sense of purpose. He never forgot about his friend Lennie, but he knew that he had to move on. He had to make a life for himself, even if it wasn't the life he had hoped for.